Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, and friends, I'm pleased to join you for this important conference on education in times of conflict and thank Educate for convening this discussion at a moment when it's urgently needed. The conference asks how education can be protected for stability, development, and peace while recognizing that the boundaries between emergency response, recovery, and long term development are increasingly blurred, and that education systems are under pressure from conflict, crisis, shrinking budgets, and growing needs. This was indeed the starting point of my recent report to the General Assembly on the right to education in armed conflicts as a human rights imperative. My central message is simple. Education in armed conflict is not a secondary service to be restored once violence ends. It is a life-saving right, a core humanitarian priority, a protective environment, and a strategic investment in peace. Most importantly, it is a human rights obligation which does not cease at the time of conflict. When a school closes because of violence, the loss is not only in days of learning. It entails protection loss, friendships broken, teachers displaced, girls pushed into early marriage, children exposed to recruitment, and communities deprived of a path back to peace. The scale of the crisis is alarming. In 2024, when I wrote my report, nearly 130 armed conflicts were recorded globally. The situation has not improved. Around 6,000 reported attacks on schools, universities, students, and educators, and cases of military use of educational facilities were identified that year. This is a 166% increase since 2021. An estimated 234 million school-aged children and adolescents were affected by crises, including armed conflict. The number went up to 273 million this year and has been rising for the last 7 years. Yet teachers continue to teach without salaries, materials, or protection. Students study in tents, shelters, online, on the streets, when electricity and connectivity allow. Families often have to choose between flight, survival, and education. Attacks also reflect something deeper, the erosion of public trust, social cohesion, cultural memory, and institutional life. In my report, I refer to deliberate targeting of educational systems, sometimes described as scholasticide, particularly in protracted crises. Violations include not only attacks on schools, but also military use of learning spaces, the recruitment of children, conflict-related sexual violence, ideological manipulation of curricula, and bans on the use of local language of instruction or textbooks in occupied territories. This is why we must speak not only about learning loss, but the destruction of education as an ecosystem. The right to education doesn't disappear when armed conflict begins. Wars change the conditions in which education must be delivered, but does not erase the right itself. International human rights law continues to apply during armed conflict. States must respect, protect, and fulfill the right to education. They must ensure that education remains available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable without discrimination. Obligations remain in force in emergencies. Minimum core obligations, including free and compulsory free education, primary education, and non-discrimination, are of immediate effect even during armed conflict. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has no derogation clause, and human rights mechanisms have consistently confirmed that education obligations do not simply stop in wartime. This matters because too often education is treated as a sector that can wait, important but not urgent, valuable but not life-saving, necessary for development but secondary to survival. This is a false hierarchy. Education must be delivered alongside water, food, shelter, and healthcare. Safe access to education protects children from recruitment and use by armed forces, child labor, exploitation, early and forced marriages, sexual violence, and other abuses. The continuity of safe learning offers children a sense of normalcy, psychosocial support, and recovery from trauma. Schools and other learning spaces are also often entry points for identifying vulnerable children, delivering care, and connecting children and their families to essential services. In conflict, education is one of the ways children are protected. Protecting education in armed conflict requires us to bring together international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. International humanitarian law protects civilians and civilian objects. Students, teachers, and education personnel are all civilians unless they take a direct part in hostilities. Schools and universities are civilian objects unless they become military objectives. Parties to conflict must respect distinction, proportionality, and proportions. In case of doubt, a school must be presumed to be a civilian object. International criminal law also matters. Under the Rome Statute, intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to education when they are not military objectives may constitute a war crime. Attacks on education may also form part of crimes against humanity when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilian population. Where deprivation of education is discriminatory, it may contribute to persecution as a crime against humanity. Furthermore, Article 6 of the Rome Statute defines the crime of genocide and stresses as an essential element of the crime the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The 2025 report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, expressly concluded that the evidence of the deliberate destruction of educational sites could be used to infer intent to physically destroy the group, and that the attacks on education were aimed at causing irreversible harm to Palestinians in Gaza by erasing Palestinian identity and culture. One of the most pressing issues is the military use of schools and universities. Unlike direct attacks, military use is not expressly prohibited in all circumstances under international law, but usage can cause schools to lose their protected civilian character and become potential military targets. It exposes children, teachers, and communities to great danger, disrupts learning, and increases the risk of recruitment, harassment, sexual violence, and exclusion, particularly for girls and marginalized groups. This is why the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict are so important, as they translate existing legal obligations into practical safeguards. These should be treated as minimum standards for restricting military use and protecting the civilian character of education. States that have not endorsed the Safe School Declaration should do so. The 123 states that have endorsed it should fully implement it in domestic law, military doctrine, operational orders, rules of engagement, training, and accountability mechanisms. This conference rightly emphasizes continuity of learning, but continuity cannot be improvised after collapse. It must be planned before crisis, financed during crisis, and sustained through recovery. Education is often the first service disrupted and the last restored. Each day that schools remain closed increases the risk of abuse of children. States and partners must integrate education into national emergency preparedness, humanitarian response, and post-conflict recovery plans. This means conflict-sensitive analysis, risk mapping, contingency strategies, teacher deployment plans, mental health support, inclusive infrastructure, safe reopening procedures, and protected budget lines. My report recommends that education be made part of preparedness and recovery planning at national, subnational, school, and community levels. It calls for predictable funding, protected educational budgets, multi-year emergency funding, mental health support for learners and educators, and stronger ministry coordination capacity. A refugee child must not be excluded because of missing documents. A displaced child must have prior learning recognized. A child with disabilities must not be left behind because temporary classrooms are inaccessible. A girl must not be forced out because the route to school is unsafe. A student in an occupied territory must not be cut off from their language, curriculum, or identity. The test of an education system in conflict is not whether some learning continues for children. It is whether the children most at risk are still seen, reached, and protected. Impunity remains one of the greatest drivers of repeated attacks on education. Education-related crimes are often under-investigated and under-prosecuted. Investigators may treat destroyed schools as collateral damage. Prosecutors may fail to identify the education-related elements of broader crimes. The right to education may still be wrongly perceived as aspirational or non-justiciable. This must change. States should establish effective national mechanisms to investigate, prosecute, and sanction perpetrators of education-related crimes. Investigators and prosecutors should be trained to document education-related harms, including deprivation of education as persecution, destruction of records, interruption of certification pathways, gendered harms, cultural erasure, and long-term consequences. My report recommends that states explicitly criminalize attacks on education and the military use of educational facilities in domestic law. Criminalization can provide recognition and redress to victims, deter future attacks, and help strengthen state practice against attacks on education and the military use of educational facilities. If the law treats the destruction of a school only as a damage to a building, it misses the real harm, which is the destruction of a protected space for children's development and growth. Accountability is not only about punishing yesterday's violations, it is one of the strongest tools we have to prevent tomorrow's attacks. I wish to also highlight an issue that deserves more attention, which is education itself can be a form of reparation. For a child whose school has been bombed, whose teacher has disappeared, whose language has been suppressed, or whose education has been forcibly disrupted, returning to learning can be part of justice. Reparative education must acknowledge harm and help repair wrongdoing. It may require accelerated learning, psychosocial support, financial assistance, recognition of interrupted education, community reintegration, and support for caregivers. Now let me turn to an issue that is too often overlooked in education and crisis discussions, which is the politics of curriculum. In conflict, the question is not only whether children learn, it is also what they are taught, in which language, whose history is erased, and whether education helps prevent the next cycle of violence. The right to education, beyond access, is also a right to education of acceptable content and quality. According to international aims of education, it must be directed to the full development of the human personality, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, appreciation of cultural diversity, understanding, tolerance, equality, and peace. These aims are particularly important for children living in situations of armed conflict. Education can help societies move away from violence. It can strengthen critical thinking, empathy, pluralism, truth-telling, and respect for diversity. But education can also be weaponized. Curricula may be militarized. Textbooks may erase minorities. History teaching may glorify violence or deny atrocities. Children may be taught hatred, obedience, or suspicion rather than understanding, equality, and peace. Local languages may be banned. Cultural identities may be suppressed. Education may be used for forced assimilation, ideological control, or recruitment. The report gives concrete examples of these risks. Curriculum is in fact never neutral. So who decides what children learn? Which textbooks are permitted? Which language is recognized? Which national history is taught? Which identities are legitimized and which made invisible? International law protects children from indoctrination and ideological manipulation. States must ensure that educational content is free from discriminatory propaganda, militarization, and incitement to hatred. They must safeguard children's identity, family life, cultural belonging, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and access to information. It's not enough to reopen schools if what is taught prepares children for hatred, erasure, or renewed violence. We must also recognize that many children live in territories controlled by non-state armed actors. International humanitarian law binds all parties to armed conflict, including non-state armed groups. At the same time, engagement with such groups is often blocked by political sensitivities, sanctions, counterterrorism rules, or fear of implying recognition or legitimation. We need legal and policy frameworks that allow humanitarian and human rights engagements without conferring political legitimacy. This may include action plans with the United Nations, adherence to humanitarian commitments, dialogue through trusted intermediaries, and incremental protection commitments such as limiting school use, suspending recruitment near schools, or allowing safe access to school. Community leaders, teacher unions, religious leaders, local organizations, and civil society actors often have the legitimacy and knowledge needed to influence behavior. They should be supported, not left to carry this burden alone. And of course, none of this is possible without financing. The concept note rightly points to the contradiction between growing needs and shrinking education budgets. If education is treated as residual in budgets, it will become residual in recovery. And if it is residual in recovery, peace will be built on exclusion. Financing education in conflict is not charity. It's part of compliance with human rights obligation. It is also an investment in protection, recovery, accountability, and peace. The partnerships discussed in this conference are therefore essential, but they must be principled as well as efficient. They must protect the civilian character of education, uphold the best interests of the child, ensure participation of learners, teachers, and communities, and preserve the human rights aims of education. Let me close with a concrete agenda for action. States should fully implement international standards protecting education in armed conflict, including the Safe Schools Declaration and relevant Security Council resolutions. Criminalize attacks on education and the military use of educational facilities in national legislation. Strengthen accountability, remedy, and reparation, including child-sensitive investigations and reparative education. Integrate education into emergency preparedness, humanitarian response and recovery plans with protected budgets and crisis-sensitive planning. Guarantee continuous, inclusive, safe, and quality education for all learners, including girls, displaced children, children with disabilities, refugees, and minorities. Protect educational content from ideological manipulation, militarization, forced assimilation, discriminatory propaganda, and cultural erasure. Strengthen data collection and monitoring, not only for statistics, but for protection, prevention, and accountability. Where relevant, states should engage non-state armed actors to secure concrete commitments to protect education without legitimizing violations. In times of conflict and turmoil, education is not the reward that comes after peace. It is one of the ways that peace is built. Protecting education is therefore a humanitarian response, an investment in peace, and overall a human rights imperative. Thank you.